Hi there, welcome to today's video where I'm going to share with you my top baking tips for polymer clay artists. Although this video is aimed at beginners, it might be useful for the more established artists too because it has a focus on model making, so stay tuned if you're interested. So baking tip number 1 is probably the most obvious of all, and it's baking sheets. I couldn't be without these in the studio. I've got about 3 I think, and I've had them for years, and they were the cheapest in the store. You know, you don't have to buy quality items for polymer clay baking, but what I would suggest is that you keep them entirely separate from your day-to-day cooking utensils because you want to avoid any cross-contamination. So yeah, a pretty obvious essential tool for polymer clay baking. For baking tip number 2, it's greaseproof paper. Greaseproof paper or parchment paper is really important when it comes to baking. Firstly, it will stop your models from sticking to your baking sheets, but I find it's really useful to work on as well because it allows you to move your models around without causing any damage to any bases, etc. So I'd really recommend that you have this in your polymer clay studio. Baking tip number 3 is mugs. Mugs are an essential tool, I think, for when it comes to baking models because you need some kind of support so that your models don't fall over or fall flat or fall apart, and they're not going to cause any damage. Well, they shouldn't cause any damage, so make sure that you don't throw any of your old mugs away. Grab them and put them in your polymer clay studio because you'll be really grateful that you did. I tend to position my models a little bit like this when they're baking, so there's a little bit of support at the back so you know that they don't fall over or anything. Baking tip number 4, pressure points. I'd just be aware of how you place your models with your mugs, because if your model's leaning on your mug in any way, you'll end up with indentations during the baking process, so the mug should really be there in case your model looks like it's going to fall over, etc. while it's baking, but it shouldn't act as a balance in any way because, you know, you're going to end up with some flaws in your work. They can actually touch while they're going through the baking process, but your mug shouldn't be acting as a balance in any way. Hope that makes sense. Baking tips 5 and 6, they kind of go together actually. Make sure your oven is preheated and have great ventilation going on during the baking process. Polymer clay really stinks while it's baking, and I think that's true of pretty much all polymer clay brands, so have doors open, windows open for a good sort of 15 minutes afterwards as well, because it's really quite a pungent smell and you know you don't want that going in your lungs or anything. And if possible, I'd leave the doors open while you're baking as well if it doesn't impact too much on your oven temperature. And of course a preheated oven is really important. When I first started using polymer clay, I used to kind of rush the process a bit, shove my work in way too soon, and I'd wonder why it was all crumbly at the end. So follow the guidelines pretty strictly and you should be okay. For baking tip number 7, make sure your models have lots of support while they're cooling. I know in the past I've just assumed that because a model's baked well that it's going to cool well as well, and I've not really given any thought to the fact that it can become quite unstable during the cooling process if it hasn't got any supports. And similarly, if your model hasn't baked perfectly, you can always try and manipulate your model a little bit, not too far, while it's cooling as well. So you know, if your base is a bit unstable or if your model's kind of gone off at a slight slant, it is possible to try and support them while they're cooling, and I have done this with my hands many times. It does take a while, it can take a good half an hour, so make sure you've got a good YouTube video to watch during the process. But I've managed to save a project many a time by doing this, so just be careful that it's not too hot to touch. Your hands are really important, you don't want to damage them in any way. So, you know, just be careful with your hands and you might be able to save a project. So for baking tip number 8, it's going to be the last one for today, is rebaking. I think there's often a little bit of confusion with those new to polymer clay about the fact that you can rebake your work. Certainly for model making, it's an important part of the process because you often need to build new work on top of old, just to ensure that there's a good balance there, because sometimes you'll need a solid base to work from. So I've certainly baked some pieces 4 or 5 times just to get the end result that I've wanted. Particularly with wedding cake toppers actually, they go through numerous bakes because there's so many elements to consider. So as long as your clay's been conditioned well and there's no obvious flaws in your work, and as long as you're following your Polymer Clay's guidelines, there's no reason why you can't rebake your work. So yeah, rebake it. So I think that's it for today. If I think of any further tips, I'll write a list and might do a follow-up to this video at some point. Or I might do a Q&A actually about polymer clay, baking tips, etc. Yeah, we'll wait and see. But thanks ever so much for watching, and I'll see you again soon. Bye bye.